To begin with lesson 1, sort of this story of the Westminster Confession of Faith, I want to read to you 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 13. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 13. Paul writes to Timothy, "Follow the pattern of the sound words that you have heard from me in the faith and love that are in Christ Jesus." Paul is urging his student, his son in the faith, Timothy, to follow the pattern of sound words. There's two things I want us to note about this. The first is there are sound words, words that are whole, that are complete, that are healthy, words that add meaning and value and goodness to our lives. But there are also words that have a pattern to them. They lay out for us colors and shapes and sizes that organize our thoughts and our feelings, and we are to follow them into their application. This is something of the ground theologically for a Westminster Confession of Faith, for any confession of faith. That not only do we have the original words themselves here in the pages of Scripture that are themselves sound, they are whole, they are health-giving. They are also able to give us a pattern of how to think, of how to reason. And so we not only follow the actual words themselves, which are big and beautiful and bright, but we are also then able to extend those words into other areas of life. And that's what the confession helps us do. The other thing I want us to see in the verse is that in using sound words to form a pattern for thought and feeling and speech, we're also to receive them from others, that we should be a little bit wary about trusting our own judgments when we apply the pattern of Scripture's words to our lives. I was speaking earlier with Stephen and Carla about the diversity of sermon practice or of sermon preparation. And my particular process is I sit down with the text, I read it, I write down some notes, I write down an outline, I try to think through it and figure out what is this text talking about, what does it mean for our lives. I basically write my sermon outline just sitting with the text and working through the text. Then I go to the commentaries and find out all the ways that I was wrong and find all the ways that I didn't, things I didn't think of, things I didn't see. And the commentaries help me with that so that I'm not alone in my thoughts. So that Timothy knows the pattern of sound words is something he receives from others, and it's not just from him. In order that there might be faith and love in Christ Jesus. Paul will emphasize this repeatedly, that the purpose of sound doctrine, the purpose of the Westminster Confession of Faith, I hope this comes through in the telling of the story this afternoon, in telling the theology on Monday morning. The purpose of the Westminster Confession of Faith is faith in Jesus Christ and love in Jesus Christ. So often, if you've ever hung around Reformed Christians a bit, there are some of us who are tempted to use the confession of faith as a way to beat people up. Yes? Have you ever met anyone like that? Have you ever been someone like that? Where you want to use the doctrine as a weapon. This is how I keep wolves away. You want to use the doctrine as a fence. This is how I keep people penned in. But the Apostle Paul tells Timothy that the pattern of sound words, the sound teaching that comes from Scripture, is designed to produce faith and love in us. When I was a little boy, I grew up on a dairy farm in upstate New York, and 20 minutes up the road was a Christian Missionary Alliance church. I don't know that you have that denomination here, but you probably have churches that are similar. We really didn't believe in anything in particular other than you should have biblical preaching. Your Bible should be what your pastor preaches. You should have believers-only baptism. You should be premillennial, and you should be dispensational, and things like that. I've come a long way, right? For those of you who know where those issues land in the RPCNA or RPCS. But there was one little weird quirk. When I was a little boy in that church, they had discovered a document that they thought was really cool. It was called the Westminster Shorter Catechism. And so when I was a little boy in this dispensational, Arminian, premillennial, credo Baptist, believers baptism church, they made me and all my siblings and all the other kids in Sunday school learn the Westminster Shorter Catechism. So I grew up thinking that Westminster was a Baptist document. I thought it was weird that it had this section on infant baptism. I didn't know why it did that, because we clearly didn't do that. And then somewhere along the way, I slowly learned that it's a Presbyterian document. And it wasn't until many years later, in fact, it wasn't until a few years ago, that I discovered that the story, Westminster, is the standard for Presbyterian churches and doctrine, is actually telling the story from the end backward. It ends up being the Presbyterian standard, but it didn't start out that way. So let me start the story a little bit for you, and going back a little bit before. There are four major changes that come to Great Britain that shape the story of understanding Westminster. The first is religious. So the Reformation comes across the channel from the continent, and it lands in England, Scotland, and Ireland differently. Different doctrines are adopted more quickly than others. Different changes to worship and government are received more willingly than others in different areas. And so along comes the 1640s, when this people group, who are not quite convinced that they are in fact one people group, I understand that still remains the case, they are wrestling with, do we want to be one church? And if we're going to be one church, then we're going to figure out how to bring the levels of Reformation up to be all the same. And that's one of the purposes of Westminster, to sort out what is Irish Reformation, Scottish Reformation, and English Reformation all mean when we all occupy the same two islands. They're trying to sort that out. The second is a political story. There's a rise in power in Parliament at the same time. James, so here you guys would call him James the Sixth. Down south, they call him James the First. And he has the famous phrase, no bishop, no king. He clearly understands that this Reformation business and how it came to England, Scotland, and Ireland actually has political implications. There's politics tied up in the religion. That's always been the case, hasn't it? Politics and religion are often inseparable, hard to separate. And we certainly have heard that as we have visited these last 2 weeks. Everyone finds out I'm a minister, so the first thing we do is we have a religious conversation. They've discovered I'm an American, so the second thing we have is a Trump conversation. Religion and politics still side by side. This rise in Parliament, this struggle for politics, is fueled by a third change. There's a technological story taking place in Great Britain as well. Internationalism has come to town. Globalism is settling in a new way. These islands, which had been somewhat isolated from the continent in a distinct way, were finding themselves enmeshed in a larger phenomenon, sometimes called the international Reformed community. In the 1640s, for instance, while it is simply Englishmen sitting in the Westminster Assembly writing the Westminster Confession of Faith, there are, at least at any given time, 4 Scottish commissioners, sometimes 6, sometimes 8, Scottish commissioners sitting there advising them. Interestingly enough, they had invited a bunch of Americans to come. Even more interestingly, all the Americans said no. It's a different story for a different day. They had also been corresponding with the Dutch Reformed churches. So the Westminster Assembly, while the voting populace on the floor trying to make the decisions of what to put into the confession are English, they're being shaped by Scottish, Irish, American, and Dutch influences. It's an international phenomenon. The other one is that literacy is taking over society. At this time, everything that is debated within the Westminster Assembly ends up falling out all over the presses. And this is what I have called in one of my articles the Wild West of the literary press. So you guys can associate it most closely with the phenomenon of social media. What happened when they how do you say that word? Launched Facebook and Twitter, now X, TikTok. Everyone could say anything about anything all at once. That's how it felt in the 1640s, because printing presses came to England, and all of a sudden these theologians, these pastors, anybody who had the money, anybody who had the time, could simply put together a book or a pamphlet and say, you should believe this, you should do that in the church. And they actually have a word for this, it's called the pamphlet wars. So they get into this great big pamphlet wars, and it sounds a lot like our X, our Facebook, our debates back and forth on the internet. There were no rules, no regulations. So you have this Reformation. How are we going to bring it together into one cohesive church? It's three parts. You have these politics. What's going to be? Monarchy or parliament or some combination thereof? And the tension around those two questions is fueled and driven by the fact that the whole world is watching, and fueled by the fact that the literacy is taking over and just about anybody can publish anything. A guy I know and am following, John Cotton, he was a minister in Boston, England for 20 years. And when that kind of fell apart, he came to Massachusetts and was a minister in Boston, USA for 20 years. He was a minister in Boston for 40 years. The two Bostons were 3,000 miles apart. Of the 15 books that are attributed to him, 5 of them actually came from his pen. 10 of them were made up, not from him. Because it was the Wild West. You could show up at a printer and say, I have a book from John Cotton, and you're lying. And it gets published with John Cotton's name on it. Because no one was checking. There were no fact checkers. And so you're living in this awkward world of trying to figure it out. Let me tell you a little story that hopefully brings all this together. The fourth piece is the commercial story. The middle class starts to take over Britain. There's a rise in money and in business. There's a man named Oliver. His great-great-grandfather, Morgan, also known as William, was a medieval brewer. Made beer, didn't make a lot of money, lived in a small house with a bunch of kids. But the Reformation came to town. And when you get a Reformation in town, that means that there's a bunch of monasteries, you know where the monks live, that are now available. They're for sale. Because we have a Reformation now. And so we threw the monks out. And so that great big stone building on the hill surrounded by all those vineyards and orchards, that's for sale. Well, William, the great-great-grandpa of Oliver, this brewer of beer who never made more than a few pence a year, gets the job of selling the properties. Which means that every time he gets the deed of a different Catholic diocese, monastery, whatever, in the area, he goes and he surveys the property. He confirms that the deed is accurate. And if it's a really nice piece of property, he slips the deed into his pocket and looks at the next deed. And if it's not so nice, he sells that one. Needless to say, by the time William is done, he's not brewing beer. He's a landowner with a sizable amount of land. A few generations later, Oliver is born to this family. They don't have a lot of money, but they do have a lot of property. Oliver realizes that he needs to do something. By the way, you guys know this guy's last name, right? He gets elected to Parliament. Noticing the themes here? His family's position has risen to middle class. He's learned to read and write in a school. He has connections in America. He's actually thought about moving there. because he's worried about the state of the country. He has relationships in Holland. He writes to them and they write to him. But instead he runs for Parliament to wrestle with the king over the issues of Reformation. His congregation is strongly Puritan. He himself is actually rather famous for having found a bit of the leftovers from the Catholic presence, and he's cast them out violently during a worship service. This is a man who's living in his moment. His last name is Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell. So all of this is the pressure that is coming together in 1642. Charles I goes to war with Parliament. It's a civil war, the English Civil War. And we in America, we fought 2 more after you. So you guys had the first English Civil War, 1640s. We had the second English Civil War, 1770s. And we weren't done, so we did it again in the 1860s. Hopefully we're all done fighting each other for a while. In 1642, they have gone to war over power and over money. Charles is broke. He needs Parliament for money. Parliament is happy to give him money, but they want changes. And Charles doesn't want changes. The impasse leads to war. In the midst of the war, June 12th, what's today's date? 15th. So we missed it by 3 days. But on June 12th, 1643, so we missed it by 3 days in a year, Parliament called for ministers to be gathered, theologians to be gathered, in order to set forth government, liturgy, and doctrine for the Church of England, in order for the church to be pure and reformed. July 1st, 1643. Clearly they were doing something behind the scenes, right? When have you ever seen your government pass a ruling on June the 12th that went into effect on July the 1st? I mean, my government doesn't work like that. Maybe yours does. But nothing they do on June the 12th is going to come out on July the 1st. This is really quick. William Twiss opens the proceedings to revise the 39 articles, the confession of the church in England. On August 19th, the Scots decide they want to get in on it too, and they send down their commissioners. They have 4 commissioners that are sent. Alexander Henderson, the minister of Lukers, this story of him that I like to tell, that I learned when we were staying outside the building in Lukers. He was due to be installed in that church, but that church learned that he was an unbeliever. He was unconverted, and so they didn't want him. So they all assembled for his installation service, locked the door so that he couldn't get in. So he broke a window and climbed in and was installed as their minister. I'm glad Stephen didn't start his ministry this way. Glad I didn't start my ministry this way. A few months later, Alexander Henderson went to a conventicle, a worship service that's outside, and Robert Bruce, the great Scottish preacher, happened to be preaching on the Gospel of John. The Good Shepherd knows the sheep. The one who climbs in another way is a thief. And Alexander Henderson was convicted and converted to faith in Christ. The other one the Scots send down is Samuel Rutherford. If you've heard his name, you probably know his letters. The Loveliness of Christ is a little book that was published. Samuel Rutherford, there was an Englishman who traveled throughout Scotland, and he heard various ministers, and he said, one showed me the majesty of God, one showed me the greatness of my sin, and of Samuel Rutherford, he said, he showed me the loveliness of Christ. There was also George Gillespie. He is often said to be the youngest member of the Westminster Assembly. It's not true, though he was among the youngest. It was also said that he was called upon to pray just before the writing of the shorter catechism, when they were to answer the question, what is God? And George Gillespie stood up and said, "O God, you who are infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in your wisdom, being, power, goodness. By the time he finished praying, they had their answer to the question. This, too, is not true. George Gillespie wasn't there for the writing of the Shorter Catechism. Wish it was, but sorry. The fourth Scottish Presbyterian they send down is, save the best for last, Robert Bailey. He spells it differently, but I'm a Bailey, he's a Bailey, it's good. Robert Bailey is, to my chagrin, known as is one of the more left-leaning of the Scottish commissioners. He's known as one of the more politically operative of them, so I'm not a huge fan of that. Maybe I can rehabilitate his reputation one day. We'll see. But these are the Scottish Presbyterians who go down to speak to the Westminster Assembly. What they find there is a bunch of invitations have gone out to the English Anglicans, none of whom choose to go. Do you know why the Anglicans didn't want to go? Because the invitation included these words, that the present church government in England, by hierarchy of bishops and archbishops, is evil. Given that the invitation to participate had already ruled Anglicanism out as a possibility, most of the Anglicans didn't come, right? This is like inviting your friends to a birthday party and saying there will be no cake for little boys. How many little boys are going to the birthday party? Probably not many. But what did show up was a bunch of Presbyterians, English Presbyterians. They were in the majority by a lot. But weirdly enough, in the 1640s, not everyone agreed on what the word Presbyterian meant. So they all claimed to be Presbyterians, but they didn't all agree on what they meant by that word. There were also a lot of people that the Presbyterians called independents. Now, the independents didn't want to be called independents. They wanted to be called Congregationalists. As I said a moment ago, they also sent out invitations to the New England colonists, all of whom refused. They sent them to Netherland refugees who also refused, and they wrote books instead and started a big literary war. All of this, though, was coming together because of Parliament. It's important to remember this in terms of the story of Westminster. Parliament is paying for this, 4 shillings a day. I actually had to look this up because I don't know what a shilling is, and I don't know how much it's worth. I actually don't know what a pound is worth either. We were talking with Stephen Carla earlier about this. You guys throw things around and you're like, oh, that's worth like 5 quid. And I'm like, okay, what are quids? And why do they buy you things? 4 shillings a day in the 1640s would translate today to about 20 to 25 pounds. Still not helping me. So that's roughly 2 days' wages for a farmhand in 1640s. So a minister who went and sat in the Westminster Assembly could get paid twice as much as the local farmer for 1 day's work. So Parliament was paying pretty good. Government jobs paid okay in those days. Yeah, anyway, Parliament invited the people too. So you couldn't get into the Assembly without an invitation from Parliament. So Parliament's paying for it. Parliament's choosing the people. And then what is more, the documents that get adopted by Parliament. So when we tell the story and we say Westminster is a Presbyterian document, strictly speaking, actually what we mean is Westminster is a Parliament document. Parliament paid for it. Parliament chose who would be there, and Parliament approved the documents that got printed. The men who were there, the Presbyterians, the Independents, the guys who argued back and forth, were called consultants. They were there for advice. They were there to debate. So what did the Westminster actually do? What was their goal? Number one, chief, that we'll be looking at is the Confession of Faith. It was the belief at that time that a confession, a single document which laid out the majority, if not all that we believed, would achieve unity in a way that nothing else would. The reason for this was because we had thrown the Pope out. If you have a Pope and you all agree we are the followers of the Pope, then it's really easy to be united. You're united in the fact that you have the Pope and you are under him. If you have, pick and choose some other distinction, right? We all share the name Bailey. That's what we're united by. We are the Baileyites. This is what unites us. But what if you get rid of family association? What if you get rid of church structure? What is it that makes you you? And in the Reformation Church, they were saying it was our shared belief, our common conviction. And that's why they wanted a confession so desperately. This is what unites us. This is what brings us together. Just as a little bit of a historical reference point, this belief that having one document that says all the things that we all agree on will bring us together and unite us was a belief that was sweeping all over Europe, was sweeping all over the American colonies. And it was having success almost nowhere. So the Lutherans, they make their document. But their document, most Lutherans today, most of them won't actually know or have read closely their Confession of Faith. But they do know Martin Luther. And so there's all these studies into Luther, but not into the confession. And then similarly, we have all of these associations that we make that make us one, but not in our confession. The Westminster Confession of Faith, for instance, was intended to unite Scotland, Ireland, and England. It kind of didn't work. It kind of didn't last. The only one that I know of from this time period that really had some success was actually Heidelberg. It was written in the Palatinate. It's like this part of Germany, France area. And it was designed to bring Reformed people who were following John Calvin and Lutherans together into one group. And it actually succeeded. It made of a group of Lutherans and a group of Reformed people one new church. It actually was successful. Most other documents were not so successful, including Westminster. The shorter and larger catechism were added to it. The purpose for this was to train children, youth, and theology students. So you guys have seen the shorter catechism and the larger catechism, right? You've got these little answers. What is man's chief end? Man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. But then we make it the larger catechism. Man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him fully forever. See, we added that adverb, fully, and made it larger. That's why we call it the larger catechism. And the shorter one was for children. So you guys are supposed to memorize 107 questions and answers. Yeah, that's what my kids had to do. The larger catechism, which was 176, I think, those were supposed to be memorized by seminary students, which we didn't have to do. So there's this instruction that is in the catechism. There's also, though, the actual aim of the assembly, which is to reform the church. To do that, they passed documents known as the Directory for Public Worship, the Directory for Church Discipline, and there are numerous other directories that were published. You know what? We kept the first three, but we kind of haven't followed the other three, even though those were the documents that Westminster was really excited about as an assembly. The confession, that's cool, but that's what we all agreed on, right? The larger and shorter catechism, that's cool, but it's just a teaching tool. The Directory for Worship and Government, that's what Parliament's paying us for. How to order the church, how to order the worship service. That's what we're here for. That's what's making the big bucks, 4 shillings a day. And yet, years later, those are the documents that we've lost. What's even more remarkable, actually, is that in the course of the years that the Westminster Assembly sat, they produced over 100 position papers. That is, opinion pieces. Here's what we believe about this doctrinal dispute. Here's what we believe about this theology and this argument. That's what the assembly spent most of its time doing, was adopting position papers on different arguments and doctrines and so on. And it's full of this approach to church and church life. As it does this, Westminster is serving as something that's exciting, a de facto Presbyterian government. So here's kind of the story as we're thrusting through. The Westminster Assembly, really, is our first synod, our first General Assembly, our first Presbytery meeting. It's where these English Presbyterians are together adopting position papers, approving directories for public worship and church discipline, setting out a catechism and a confession of faith. Those three documents, confession and catechisms, will transcend the English Presbyterian experience. But the other ones are actually just the everyday work of the church. There's one thing in particular that I've left out so far that the Westminster Assembly did more than anything else. It filled more hours of more days. The one thing that the Westminster Assembly did more than anything else was examine men for ministry and license them to preach. In fact, it was the last thing they were doing after they had finished all their documents. They were still sitting and still examining men for the ministry. So the assembly was serving as a church court, as a church authority. Let's digest this story a little bit. What do we see when we look at this story? Number one, God works his will in our time and space, playing out his plan in our history. What I mean by that is that we are seldom in control of the things we think we're running. For instance, our lives. You do make real choices in real time, and your choices have consequences. But the funny thing that we find when we look at stories from history like this one is that there's someone else who has a real purpose in mind, and he's really working it out. God intended something in history, and he achieved it, regardless of what the people on the ground intended. I could weave into this a lot of those more personal or more specific stories. So, for instance, the Scottish Presbyterians, when they first arrived at Westminster, very much wanted an alliance with the New England Congregationalists. Does that sound weird to your ears? Do you know why the Scottish Presbyterians wanted an alliance with the New England Congregationalists? They had more in common with them than they did with the English Presbyterians. Because the Scottish vision of Presbyterianism was much more like the New England version of Congregationalism, and vice versa. The English version of Presbyterianism was a different shape and size and type. And so the disagreement between them made this unlikely alliance between the Scots and the colonists. But halfway through the process, the Scottish Presbyterians, who were pretty savvy, figured out that the English Presbyterians had the majority vote, and that if they were going to get some of the concessions that they wanted in the confession, they were going to have to leave the New England Congregationalists behind and side with the English Presbyterians, which is what they did. They were working out their plans and purposes as best they could, as wisely as they could, and in the end, it was God's plan that won out. We end up with a document that shapes modern Presbyterianism, that if you sit down and if you look at 17th century Congregationalism and the Westminster Confession, you go, wait a second, you guys aren't that far apart. And if you've ever felt like some Reformed Baptist churches feel really, really like Reformed Presbyterian churches, you're finding this 400-year leftover. God has his purposes that he's working out in his time. Why couldn't they just stay together? Why couldn't they just work out their differences? I don't know. The Lord's purposes in his time. So I would definitely encourage you as young people, be neither negligent nor willful with your lives. Don't neglect to be wise and thoughtful with your time, with the gifts God has given you. Don't neglect them. Don't ignore them. Develop them, use them, give them to one another and to God and his glory. But also don't be willful. Know that your life is not entirely in your hands. You will have to trust God to govern your life as you take twists and turns you didn't expect and end up in places you maybe didn't want to be. But secondly, very often, you should know this, I hope this will resonate with you as you continue to advance in your lives. Very often, the same forces which pull together a great movement are the exact same forces that pull the same movement apart. Those powers at work in England and Scotland and Ireland that pulled together the Westminster Assembly by 1648 and 1649 were pulling the movement apart. Ultimately, what brought the Westminster Assembly to an end? What brought the transatlantic conversation over Reformation theology over to an end? The interregnum. Charles is dead and Cromwell's not on the throne, but you know what I mean. Cromwell's in charge. It's a different world. It's a Republican world. It's a reformed, but not the way the Presbyterians wanted it, world. And so in these sweeping changes, the very same forces of history which brought in the Westminster Assembly within a year of its conclusion had swept it out to sea again. So be humble. Be humble, especially when you're rising the tide of success. Be humble when you find that the world is coming together and doors are opening for you and you're having success in everything you do. Be humble, because usually the very same thing that's pushing you up will fall out from underneath you shortly. But likewise, be circumspect, be thoughtful. Recognize that the things that have come together in your world are not always to be trusted. You are to be grateful to God for what He is doing in your life, but recognize that not every tool that He uses is a tool that will be for your good, should you rely on it forever. There are times and seasons to life. Then thirdly, an instrument like a confession is a useful one if one uses it usefully. Here's the challenge as I see it that was produced by the Westminster Confession of Faith in our churches. We took an instrument that was designed for unity, and we have turned it into a perimeter. By making the Westminster Confession of Faith into a boundary that one must cross in order to be in fellowship, we've actually made it an instrument of division. Instead of by setting it in the middle as a goal toward which we are all moving, a set of truths in which we are all in love, a bunch of hopes for our church that we are aiming toward. In other words, instead of seeing the confession as truth in love, and that's how we're to speak to one another. That's the nature of our confession, that we say truth in love. This preposition in, I'm a big fan of Paul's prepositions. So when we speak the truth in love, that preposition in implies that there should be the context of relationship. Do you know why the Westminster Assembly worked so well? These men were great men with great minds who had profound understanding of theology and doctrine, and they debated vigorously and viciously on the floor of the assembly. And every night, when the assembly was over, when William Twiss slammed his gavel down and said, "We're adjourned for the day," they all went home to each other's houses and had a big roast with a mug of beer and put their feet up before the fire and whined and complained about the day's proceedings because they were friends. It's really interesting that one of the harshest critics of New England Congregationalists was Robert Bailey from Glasgow. He was really good friends with Thomas Goodwin, the leading Congregationalist at the assembly. They would have dinner together at each other's houses often, because they were arguing in the context of a relationship. They were speaking truth to each other while in love with each other, while being friends with each other. This is a point I am hitting very hard because our society has completely lost this, yes? So much of our church has completely lost this. When we shoot a theological truth at another person on the social media platform, I mean, how are they supposed to know that it's a look of love that I'm giving them? They can't see my face. How do they know that it's actually an expression of care? They can't feel my hand on their shoulder. They're not eating my food. They're not sitting in my comfy chair. There's no relationship. There's no love. And this is one thing that Westminster got very well right. Fourth and final thing is the summary of all these is that negotiating your time will require the humility of Ecclesiastes and the wisdom of Proverbs.